Welcome to Against Social Justice, Ep.03, Why American Universities Are the Source of Social Justice. This is a PowerPoint-based video that will summarize the connection between American universities and social justice as it stands in early 2021. So why would the madness of social justice, with its lack of evidence, internal contradictions, Orwellian doublespeak, and hateful ideas, come from academia? You see, universities used to be profoundly conservative places. They sought to preserve centuries-old ideas and add to that robust canon of knowledge in their hallowed halls. It wasn't for nothing that Rowling modeled Hogwarts after an English boarding school. Even magic was to be taught by strict disciplinarians. Well, it's all about early 20th century history coming back to bite us in the ass. The story begins with disappointed German communists after World War I. Many intellectuals there were committed to Karl Marx's idealism, but the world was not playing along like their prophets said it would. The Frankfurt School was founded in Germany's Weimar Republic between the World Wars in 1923. And these people pioneered the idea, or the idealist philosophy, of critical investigation. Now, although it sounds like critical thinking and thus a positive thing, the name, like social justice today, is more like a smiley face wallpapered over an ideology. The Frankfurt School's goal was to figure out what went wrong with the world, because it did not move ahead gloriously to institute communism, as it clearly should have. In fact, the only place that did embrace communism was backwoods Russia, and this was not the kind of place where it should have happened, which were the fully industrialized places like Germany, France, and England. The critical part of their name refers to exactly what it sounds like. They would find ways to criticize every aspect of society that wasn't communist enough, which ends up being just about everything. By this process, they extended Marx's idea of class struggle to every aspect of social living, which is where we eventually get the term critical social justice theory, and then the abbreviation social justice. The Nazis had no use for the Frankfurt School, so they fled, and mostly to America in the 1930s. Young American universities, with some communists already on the faculty, were pleased to welcome English or European intellectuals to the New World. The emigration to America brought many German artists and filmmakers and musicians as well. It was an exciting time. And the American universities were an easy target for the emigration. They wanted legitimation, and they felt that the Europeans would provide that. The American universities were so young compared to their European predecessors, it's hard to blame them for having some kind of inferiority complex. Moving into the 1940s, after Hitler plays his deadly hand, the Western world was eager to make sure that that kind of thing would not happen again. And the American version of the Frankfurt School had an attractive case to make. Their ideas were part of the fight against Nazis that they had fled. They were certainly correct in anticipating the problem, and they had a few years of first-hand knowledge of dealing with that problem when back in Germany. But more importantly, the method they were preaching was attractive. Simply put, criticism is easy. And it is not like it is hard to find things to criticize. Everyone is finely attuned to the unfairness of life if the promise is to eliminate those unfair aspects, as well as prevent further fascism from happening, especially here. Then the American academics could expand their vocation from teaching to saving the world. So rather than excellence in teaching and learning, The Frankfurt School theorists seemed to be promising that the formerly cloistered college professor really did matter, and that he could be on the front lines of historical progress. Try to imagine if you were an English professor in post-World War II America. Instead of working hard to convince your students that there are timeless lessons to learn from slogging through Shakespeare or Milton or even Keats, you could change your focus to mining the history of literature for injustices. You could present the overall themes of the work as they relate to economic class and race and sex and instances of oppression and or liberation. The new professors offered exciting classes that were popular with students. The students were encouraged to think about things like the bias of the author and the bias of past literary critics and even the bias of the reader now and then. How naughty that upper-class white heterosexual man may not have been trying to tell a great story with nuggets of wisdom about human interaction. No, that upper-class white heterosexual man was most likely trying to keep his position in society while trying to ensure the oppression of everyone not like him. If you were a professor, you could write a paper about it and get it published. It was an easy choice to make. The professors did get their ideas published, and they got tenured. At the same time, American universities proliferated in the wake of World War II with the help of the GI Bill and the baby boom. There was actually a shortage of professors. So how did the old guard of professors react to this? Well, the American old guard actually were not as steeped in the long-standing tradition of places like Oxford and Cambridge. They were less invested in holding on to the ideas that made academia what it was in Europe. Things like the primary goodness of Western culture. Things like the canon of great authors and their works. The older American professors thought that they were being gentlemen as well. For when someone comes along with a new idea, a gentleman listens. Perhaps the person has something good to say. Note that critical theorists now hate the notion of gentlemen altogether. Why not hire one of these new critical theorists in your department? Perhaps it will make the school more attractive. Perhaps you'll get more students. You'll get a new building and maybe a new office. Perhaps you'll get new books on the subject for your library. And by the 1960s, the radical professors had packaged the ideas of critical theory with activism. They developed followings on campus, students who would follow them and protest in public, and especially at the Ivy League schools, like the formerly peaceful Brown University in Rhode Island. So students have always known that college campuses are little self-contained worlds for the students during their time there, and moreover, that college was their last chance to live a pampered life before having to go out into the real world and make a living. But you see, the radical students were not going out into the workplace as much as they were staying in the field of education. They became grammar and high school teachers, or, especially, they went back to college for graduate degrees. And ultimately, they were hired in the expanding departments at which they were once students. Older professors, meanwhile, would retire or die off, and the radicals became chairmen of departments and deans, thereby controlling the hiring process. So, slowly but surely, the academy changed by hiring one radical, then another, and then it got to the point where nearly all departments were staffed by radicals, at least in the humanities. You see, with more important things to do, the sciences were able to resist the process up until the 21st century. The primarily French philosophy of postmodernism gave a significant boost to the critical theorists of the 70s and 80s. Michel Foucault's cynical idea that objective knowledge was not attainable, and that the only important thing really was that knowledge was used by dominant groups in order to oppress marginalized groups, that invigorated the social justice movement. This is where they got the idea of deconstructing everything, although it's pretty similar to what the critical theorists were doing already. The postmodernists emphasized the role of language in oppression. In fact, they saw language as the primary vehicle of oppression. With radical professors and in now administrative positions, they could begin to change codes of student conduct and speech, making them restrictive conduct and restrictive speech. The idea was to create a microcosm of what the world should be like by imposing it top down on university culture. It's important to note that the non-humanities professors either A. didn't particularly care or take seriously about what the humanities professors on campus were doing, and or B. believed that the radicals must know what they were talking about, for after all, this is academia, and we have rules around here about how we acquire knowledge. Those non-humanities professors assumed that the radical professors in the humanities had something important to say, like what was going on in the sciences. You see, the radical professors seemed to be playing according to the rules, as in the peer review process. Yet, they were not. They were starting their own journals and began publishing every and any paper that espoused the correct radical conclusions, regardless of its methodology. And the next generation of writers would come along and simply cite the older generation as if the original hypotheses had been proven. But the radical professors did not test their claims against reality. And this is how you get a journal entitled Progress in Human Geography, publishing an article called Glaciers, Gender, and Science, a feminist glaciology framework for global environmental change in research. That was, sad to say, in 2016. Now, glaciology sounds pretty scientific, doesn't it? Well, not in this case. It is a critical theory incursion into the hard sciences. Soon, the radical humanities professors would bully the science departments to the point that they had to consider things that science was designed to transcend, namely, human biases. And then, in order to receive funding, research proposals in the sciences had to explicitly declare how the project related to the principles of diversity, inclusion, and equity. So in the 21st century, not only were the students harassed with restrictive conduct and speech codes, but the faculty and staff all over universities would have a hard time keeping up with the latest social justice trends. Even well-respected faculty, even self-described radical leftist faculty members, would begin losing their jobs with the slightest infractions. Things that everybody said up until last week became forbidden suddenly, overnight, and the students would become judge and jury of the professor's intentions. So if we're counting a generation as roughly 20 years, then 4 generations have now graduated under ever-growing levels of critical social justice on college campuses. And the surprising thing that has happened in the last 10 years is that rather than failing to catch on in the workplace after graduation, radical students have started remaking the corporate workplace to accommodate more and more social justice ideas. They did this as they climbed the ladders in the private sector or directly as they colonized human resource departments around the world. And the rules they learned on campus turned into the rules for the new corporate culture, and the hiring and firing decisions would never be the same. So, what can be done? Well, one, if you must send your child to college, be sure that he or she pursue a major that is at least less afflicted with social justice, like math or chemistry. If possible, consider saving the money altogether and guiding your son or daughter into something useful, like plumbing or construction or finance. Consider private education for grammar and high school, and, well, take the long view and wait for the university system to simply implode. Now, that's a long term problem, I know. Um, Most of the radical professors have tenure, they cannot be fired. But only when the money stream dries up. Either the students stop coming or the states stop funding the schools as legislators realize that they cannot promote violent revolution with taxpayer dollars. Only when that happens will social justice take a back seat to the former goal of excellence and teaching in learning. Or perhaps online education will eclipse the brick and mortar university system at some point. So thank you, and thank you for your time and attention. Check back here for more Against Social Justice videos about every other week.